this idea that, humane education belongs just in certain places and not other places, or that solutionary thinking and learning belongs in certain places and not other places. Absolutely not. It belongs everywhere.
This is the Seedfield Podcast, the show where Antiochians share their knowledge, tell their stories, and come together to win victories for humanity. I'm your host, Jasper Nighthawk, and today we're joined by Zoe Weil for a conversation about the many challenges facing our society and how we can trace these challenges back to their roots in our education systems and take action to change them. I'm excited for this conversation because when you see education this way as the root system that underlies our other societal systems, that demands that you take education really seriously, which is something I'm already inclined to do. And it asks that you see education as a site where we can build solutions. Zoe Weil is the perfect person to have this conversation with because she's been working on this question for decades. She's done this through her work as the co-founder and president of the Institute for Humane Education. She's given popular TEDx talks, as well as published numerous books on both humane education and on the idea of becoming a solutionary. That's a term that I believe she originated. Solutionary means someone who identifies inhumane, unsustainable, and unjust systems and develops solutions that are healthy and equitable for humans, for animals, and for the earth. For the last 6 years, the Institute for Humane Education and Antioch University have been partnering to offer doctorates, master's degrees, and certificates in humane education. So that's part of why it's natural to have her on the podcast. But in the bigger sense, Zoe is the kind of person I love getting to interview. An expert who doesn't just have deep knowledge, but who also really engages in the work and shares it back out with the messy world. And one last reason to have Zoe back on the podcast, we actually had her on an episode back in season 1 in 2021. But she has since become a podcaster herself. So if you're listening to this, she has good audio. If you're watching the video version, she has, I think, one of the best video backgrounds we've had so far on the podcast. But her new podcast, Solutionary Voices, we'll link to it in the show notes, is actually launching its very first episode on the day that we're recording this podcast here. But I know they have a really packed first season. So with that, congratulations on the new podcast, Zoe, and welcome to the Seedfield Podcast.
Thank you so much, Jasper. It's really, really nice to be back.
I want to jump right in, and we usually start our interviews by disclosing our positionality, like talking about what we're bringing to the conversation and where we're coming from. But today we decided before we hit record that we want to weave that into our whole conversation. So I am setting for myself the intention that I'm going to share some of where I'm coming from as we go along.
Great.
So yeah, let's just start with why education? Why do you see this as the root of other societal problems and solutions and systems?
The education system, and there are many education systems, it's not some monolith. I think that arguably we can make a good case that it is the root system underlying other societal systems. It is where we obtain knowledge, we learn to think, we learn to relate. There are so many aspects of the education system that shape everything that humans then go on to do later in life. And for me, focusing on that system is a way to influence all systems. That if we can transform educational systems in certain ways, then we may be able to transform our economic system, our political system, our food system, our production system, our legal system, all these different systems so that they're more just and more sustainable and more humane for everyone.
Yeah, I love that. And I appreciate that you are a reformer. Like you're someone who through your work says, hey, the status quo is not serving us. I really think that students today feel often the anguish and the challenge of being in a world that is full of challenges and full of a status quo that is leading to, I mean, we could list them off: climate change, war, oppression, extreme inequality, and food insecurity. We could keep going, and of course, I think suffering of animals is part of that too. So how do you see school as playing a role in addressing the hopelessness that some youth feel today?
I'm really glad you asked that, and I think I want to share a couple of stories.
Yes,
because,
please.
This hopelessness, or in some sense, even despair about the future that a lot of young people are feeling, while it's not new, it's getting worse, and it is crossing class and race and region. So I'm going to tell a couple stories. And I'm going to start with something that happened 12 years ago. So pre-pandemic, pre the level of polarization and divisiveness that we have, pre the level of climate change that we have gotten to in the past 12 years. So 12 years ago, you'd like to think that young people maybe didn't feel quite the sense of worry about the future.
Yeah.
So I was speaking at a school in Connecticut, and these were privileged kids in this school. And I asked them what they thought were the biggest problems in the world. And they filled up a whiteboard with all the problems that adults name. And these were 5th and 6th graders. One boy even said sex trafficking. He had not been learning about this in school. And after this big whiteboard was filled, I asked the kids to raise their hands if they could imagine us solving these problems. And only 5 children of the 45 in that room raised their hands. They couldn't even imagine solving the problems. That was probably the most sobering moment in my then many decades of work as a humane educator, teaching about the interconnected issues of human rights and environmental sustainability and animal protection. I thought, if these kids can't even imagine us solving these problems, what will motivate them to try?
Yeah.
So I did a guided visualization with them, and I'll tell you the actual guided visualization because I think it's pretty powerful, and then I'll tell you what happened. So I asked them to close their eyes and imagine that they were very old and at the end of a long and well-lived life. And I asked them to picture themselves sitting on a park bench on a beautiful day, and the birds are singing, the air is clean, there hasn't been a war in as long as they can remember, nobody goes to bed hungry, we have learned how to treat each other and other species with respect and compassion. And while they're envisioning this better world, I asked them to imagine a child coming up, joining them on the park bench, and the child has been studying history and wants to know, how did everything change for the better, and asks a lot of questions. And then the child asks a final question. What role did you play in helping to bring about this better world? What did you do? So while the kids were imagining what they would say at the end of their life to a child asking that question, I asked them to raise their hands if now they could imagine us solving the problems they listed. So they had their eyes closed, but I could see them. And this time 40 hands went up in the air. All it took to transform their sense of despair into hope was imagining and visioning a better world and knowing they played a part in it. Now, fast forward a couple years, I'm speaking in a school in Guadalajara, Mexico, and I asked those 5th graders to raise their hands if they can imagine us solving the problems in the world, and every hand flies up in the air immediately. And so this is another country, but it's a similar demographic. These two were privileged children. And every hand flew up. What was different? What was different is their teacher had been teaching them in age-appropriate ways about problems in the world, specifically environmental problems, and they were engaged in solving them. They knew problems could be solved because they were learning to be solutionaries, that word. And by the way, I did not coin the word, but I have popularized the word.
Okay.
Our former executive director came up with the word, and apparently a couple other people in the world had come up with the word too. So those are two stories, but I have a couple more that happened in the last year. I was invited to speak near where I live. I've lived for 30 years in rural Maine. And I was invited to a very small working class city public high school. And I asked those kids, none of them raised their hands.
Wow.
None of them thought that the world was going to get better in their lifetimes. Now, this is, a working class city in rural Maine, in a small city in rural Maine. But these kids were the kids who were doing the best in school.
Mm-hmm.
So these kids are going to have opportunities, maybe ones that their parents didn't have, and they still felt this way.
Yeah.
This is all, and this is also not just confined to the United States. Our solutionary work, so we work with teachers and we prepare them to teach their students how to be solutionaries using a solutionary framework. And one of the schools where one of these teachers is working in Chile, there were some students, and before they started their solutionary project, they said that they thought that they would be the last generation on Earth.
Man.
And after they did their solutionary project, they didn't feel that way anymore.
Yeah.
Again, why? Because they were taking action. They were applying what they're learning in school to make a difference. And that's the power of education.
Yeah. So, I mean, what I appreciate you bringing up this, it's not exactly like double-blind study quality data, but it is, different points in time where you've had a chance to ask a classroom this very same question and you've gotten these different answers back. And I will disclose part of why I'm interested in this conversation is I'm the parent of a small child, and I have many friends who've made the decision not to have children due to similar feelings of what is this world going to look like for a next generation? And so it's a question that's dear to my own heart. Mm-hmm. But what I wanted to pull out of your story there is the question continually is, can you imagine a world where these problems are being solved? And I think what it points to is this crisis of imagination and the failure to kind of nurture an ability to create like a tangible, positive imagination, not like envisioning a utopia. You have this quote in your book, "The world becomes what we teach," where you say, "To take human beings at arguably the most curious and creative time of their lives and systematically dull and sometimes crush their curiosity, creativity, and happiness is not only bad for children, it's bad for our world." So can you talk a little bit about the opportunities to crush creativity and imagination and the ways schools can sometimes do that, and then the opportunity that is there?
I wonder what percentage of viewers or listeners felt a combination of boredom and anxiety in school. And I bet that percentage is really high. And it just doesn't have to be that way. I mean, we take children and we often tell them that their questions don't even matter. And, you look at kids who are so young and so curious and have a million questions. Imagine if we took that curiosity and now we live in an era where we can find the answers out to those questions really fast. And sometimes those questions are in nature, so we could spend time in nature to the degree that we can. But even in the middle of our biggest cities, you can find a tree and you can find plants growing through the concrete and you can see birds. And we can invite children to ask questions and explore the answers and delight in their relationships with each other and their relationship with nature. And then we can nurture all of that as they get older to what they actually care about. So, kids are generally deeply compassionate. I mean, we all are. Compassion is a birthright. the only people who lack compassion are people who have sociopathy or psychopathy, right? Like, this is just who we are as human beings. And when we nurture that compassion by saying, you feel this pain for others, whether those others are other humans or other animals, we're going to help you use your emerging literacy and numeracy and scientific thinking. We're going to help you use these skills, and you're going to apply them to helping others, apply them to solving problems. And then suddenly, like, one can imagine solving problems. One can imagine taking action. And as soon as we take action, that feeds all these other positive qualities like meaning and purpose and a sense of agency. So all of these things can be nurtured from young children all the way up to college students. And if we could do that, if we could transform our educational system in these ways, the very purpose of education.
Yeah.
Just imagine who we would graduate. These life-filled, love-filled, compassionate solutionaries, ready and able to address the systemic causes of our problems.
Yeah, and I don't think you have to just purely imagine these people. Like, I do encounter many people who I think have had wonderful educational experiences, and maybe it wasn't all of their every year or every teacher, but there were meaningful people who did engage and said, this is what you care about, here are the tools, go forward and do this, and made education so joyful. And I think I personally had some of those experiences, though I also had other experiences that pushed the other way and made it much more like what you're describing, of kind of boredom and anxiety mixed together, and even like fear for safety around bullying. But I think when you meet people who've had those experiences, it often is you're like, wow, you are just like going through the world and feeling your agency and acting in all of these powerful ways. But I would say, I think many of these people are children of wealth, people who grew up in extremely wealthy school districts, people who had parents who were able to hire special tutors, who were able to give their children the best education possible. And I think, reading in your work, I think I appreciate that you consistently point to the inequities in our public school system, and the way that the people who the students who come from families that already have the most are often the students where our public education system does the least to support them.
Yeah, well, we have this sort of insanely inequitable system where property taxes are a big source of funding for schools. So the wealthier the neighborhood, the more money there is for the schools. I mean, the Department of Education, I know that the Trump administration has been dismantling it step by step. It still exists, and it still has a mission statement. And the mission statement is actually to prepare students for global competitiveness, and to do this by ensuring equal access. Well, we don't have equal access, so there's already a problem. And is global competitiveness really the right mission? So we could talk about both those things separately. But one of the things that has been just incredibly beautiful to see with the solutionary work that teachers are bringing to their students is how it is helping students to address problems in their own communities. So we were able to do deep work in our home state of Maine. Maine is a rural state, is a very high poverty state. And these kids are suddenly, there's one story I could tell you about this one community where none of the kids, when the teacher asked them at the beginning of the school year, do you plan to live here when you are older? None of the kids raised their hands.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
The communities are just, they're really struggling.
Yeah.
But after doing this solutionary work, a lot of them were like, yeah, I want to live here, because they could see that they could make a difference in their own community. The other thing that was really interesting to see was how the solutionary framework itself, the process of becoming a solutionary, which includes these 4 phases of identifying a problem you want to solve, investigating it thoroughly, innovating a solution, and then implementing the solution. So ideally, teachers will use this and invite the students to address a problem that they care about. So students have buy-in right away because they are solving a problem they care about. So one boy wanted to address the problem of immigrants taking jobs away from people in his state.
Mm-hmm.
And where is he hearing this problem? He's hearing it in our media. It's all over, right? This is one of those very divisive issues. And the teacher trusted the process. The boy began learning about the problem, and it did not take long to learn that this actually wasn't a problem in his state, that there was an opposite problem, which there weren't enough workers to do many of the jobs that the state needed, that his community needed. So he changed the problem that he wanted to address. And so trusting this process of allowing kids to do the deeper dive, to not get stuck in the framing that is happening in our society, but to really do the research, really do the investigation, find out what really matters to them.
Yeah. So we've been talking about humane education, and you laid out kind of the 4 steps of solutionary thinking. But I was hoping that you could define humane education a little bit more for us and talk about why you think it's important.
So humane education explores the interconnections between human rights and environmental sustainability and animal protection, along with culture and change making, so that people can understand how interrelated these issues are and address them and build a more just and sustainable and peaceful and humane world. So that is its purpose. And actually, our graduate programs with Antioch are the only comprehensive humane education programs in the United States of their kind. And so it's a field that draws people who care about not only people, not only animals, not only the environment, but all of life, and who really want to figure out how can we educate to build a world where everybody can thrive.
Yeah, that's a beautiful mission. And I know that your programs, some of them are pointed at classroom teachers, but you also have like an MA that is pointed much more towards other people maybe in the educational field, or who feel like drawn to humane education. Can you talk about some of these outside of the classroom places where people are seeking this education?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's so many ways to educate in the world, right? And in fact, I have never been hired to be a classroom teacher in a school system, and I have been an educator for more than 40 years. So I've worked at nonprofits. Many of our students and graduates work at nonprofits. Some of them are environmentally focused nonprofits, some are animal focused nonprofits, some are social justice focused nonprofits. Some students get to bring it all together the way we do in their work. And many are educating through the arts or through businesses or through writing, filmmaking. There's just so many different ways that people can educate. And so we use that term very, very broadly. The solutionary work that I've been describing that we do with teachers, that is right now, that has been focused on preparing classroom teachers. But our graduate programs with Antioch are really, the sky's the limit, like open to anybody who wants to learn about these interconnected issues and educate in any kind of context about them.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you to elaborate also about kind of like where you would draw the boundaries of the work of educating new generations of students. We're talking about education as being kind of the root system underneath all of these other systems, but obviously that happens in families, that happens out in communities, it happens on sports teams, it happens really everywhere where young people are. So can you talk a little bit about who all you're trying to reach with the Humane Education way of understanding the world?
Probably everyone, right? I mean, it's interesting that, the sort of last thing that I heard you say in that list was sports. And we had a student in the graduate program who he's an athlete, and he created a program called Solutionary Athletes, because there are so many issues in sports that relate to justice and sustainability, and he brought those issues to athletics. So I think it can happen anywhere, and it can happen in all contexts. So our solutionary work is happening globally. We're in more than 66 countries. We're in many countries in Africa, and the teachers there are so eager to bring this solutionary thinking to their students in some of the most desperately poor areas, where the kids are creating vegetable gardens at their school as part of their solutionary projects, so that they have some source of food in their day if their parents and their community doesn't have enough food for them. So this idea that, humane education belongs just in certain places and not other places, or that solutionary thinking and learning belongs in certain places and not other places, absolutely not. It belongs everywhere. To the degree that we can help people to recognize injustices and unsustainability and inhumanity and do something about it in their own contexts, in their communities. I mean, for privileged kids, it's a way of really reaching out to help the community around them. For kids who are struggling themselves, it's a way of actually improving their own lives and not being solely at the mercy of the systems around them, because they are learning to be systems thinkers and transform those systems to the degree that they and their teachers can help them do that.
Yeah. And I appreciate the empowering of saying to students, here is a toolkit for you to address some of the problems. And we'll support you as you identify real solutions, as opposed to only being served, educational materials. You're asking students to actually go out and act upon the world. But I was also interested in reading your book. That was the book, The World Becomes What We Teach, that you distinguish between kind of superficial solutions and what you call like solutionary solutions. But yeah, you say, often ideas to solve problems might seem very promising until we analyze them deeply and discover that they may result in harms that are hard to see initially, or that may not address the causes of the problem so it can be solved at the root or systemic level. And I wonder if you could share a little bit about the perils of a sort of surface level solution and why you think that we need to go deeper.
Yes. So one of the things that defines a solutionary is trying to solve problems at their root and or systemic level in ways that do the most good and the least harm for people, animals, and the environment. So that's the definition. And embedded in that definition are a couple of really important things. Solutionary work is not the same as humanitarian work. We need humanitarians. And I don't want anybody to think I am dissing humanitarianism. We desperately need humanitarians. If we are only humanitarians, however, if we are only trying to alleviate suffering and harm when it's already occurred, but we are not addressing the causes of that harm, then we're going to be humanitarians trying to put out fires forever. So we also need to be solutionaries, and by looking at those root and systemic causes. And then this piece of doing the most good and the least harm to people, animals, and the environment is really important because it's the ethical foundation. It's the principle that undergirds the whole solutionary way of thinking. And there's so many solutions that seem like they're good solutions until we realize, oh, there are going to be a bunch of animals harmed by this, or, oh, we're going to harm ecosystems if we do this, and vice versa, right? Like, we're going to protect these animals. Well, what are the impacts on people from that? Can we look at problems in all their complexity and really strive to do the most good and least harm for everyone? It's not easy, but let's think about it. Let's not exclude anyone as we try to go about doing this. And if I could tell a story that I wrote about in the book.
Yeah.
So, and this is a story about either or framing and thinking that is so commonplace in our culture, in our politics, in our media, and in our schools. And this goes back to the 1990s, and I share it not because there are not plenty of polarizing examples I could give now, but because I wanted to say what happened from this story. So in the 1990s, and you probably remember this because you grew up in Northern California, but in the Pacific Northwest, not too much further north than you, there was a huge conflict when the northern spotted owl was placed on the endangered species list because the population of this owl was dwindling. And where does this owl live? It lives in the old growth forests in the Pacific Northwest. So this ignited this huge conflict between environmentalists and loggers.
Yeah.
And there were lawn signs that people put up. This house is supports loggers, and it was very ugly and very vicious. And the media just amplified this, and so did politicians. And very few people were talking about what can we do to ensure that the people in these communities have jobs and we protect the owls. Like, how could we do this? We weren't even asking that question. It was just a conflict. Whose side were you on? So many people did lose their jobs, and not as many as people said were going to happen. And the owl's habitat was protected, but the owl numbers continued to decline. Now, whether that was because of all the damage that had already been done or other factors was uncertain. But what's happened now is that barred owls have moved in to the habitat of northern spotted owls. They're essentially cousins. They look a lot alike. They're not the same species. The barred owls are out competing the northern spotted owl. And where are people today on this issue? Well, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service wants to kill the barred owls because they're out competing the northern spotted owls. So I often bring this up because I ask people, like, if you were on the side of the owls back in the 1990s, where are you now? Like, do you really think it's okay to just kill thousands and thousands of barred owls because they're out competing northern spotted owls? Like, we're just now we're in a different either or. And how can we look at the root causes of problems and try to address them at their source to the degree that we're able to do the most good and the least harm, not to do all good and no harm, which is impossible, but the most good and the least harm, or even more good and less harm? How can we do that? We do it by not just choosing a side and arguing, but by really looking at all of the complex factors and trying to address them.
Yeah, that's an interesting story that you've brought up, because then the end is the government hiring hunters with, high-powered rifles to go out and kill owls, and that's how you're going to save these other owls. And there are so many examples like this. And if like you're suggesting, we looked at these with more complexity and also like a holistic set of values, rather than just boiling this question down to, do we keep the owls alive, or by eliminating a bunch of jobs, or do we keep the jobs but the owls all die? And that sort of assumes that there's no way to find a deeper solution where maybe we can do some of both.
Right. And, to get back to how we might talk about our positionality in the context of this conversation, I'm really aware that I come at this with like a deep and abiding love of nature and animals. And I've always felt that, even growing up in Manhattan, like always felt that. And that I come at this without ever having to have worried about where my food is coming from and whether I have shelter and can I get a job to support my family. So if I'm growing up in a logging community, and I live in rural Maine, so many of my friends have grown up and they live off this land.
Yeah.
And we have different perspectives and values. And we can still come together and talk about these issues together. Like, how could we make this better? How can we bring a solutionary mindset to whatever this underlying problem is and see where we get to? And I feel like it's really important for me to have those conversations with a range of people. And in the solutionary framework, in that second phase of investigation, we urge students to reach out to as many different stakeholders as they can. And by stakeholders, these are sometimes obviously the people who are impacted by the problem and the representatives who can speak for the animals and for the environment who are impacted by the problem, but also the stakeholders who are benefiting from the systems that support that problem. Because if we don't hear from them and we don't engage with them, if they have all the power, there's a good chance that we're just going to come up against this big conflict. But if we can engage with them and really help understand each other, there's the chance we can include them as allies to find solutions that will work for everyone. I know that may sound a little Pollyanna-ish, but what's the alternative, right? The alternative is that we often choose a side and we argue and we fight and we don't actually get to better solutions. And we live in a world with so many problems that are eminently solvable if we could come together and look at their systemic and root causes, and with open minds and open hearts and a collaborative approach, we could solve problems. It's just not the way we go about things. And that is why I believe it's so fundamental that we educate a generation of solutionaries so that they grow up doing this all along, and they will not be inclined to be forced into a side rather than looking at the underlying problem and trying to solve it together.
We are running out of time, Zoe, but I've been so appreciating having you on the podcast. And I was hoping, as a last question, if you could share one step that our listeners, myself, could take to support this kind of learning in our communities, in our families, and also in ourselves.
For your community, for your school, bring these ideas. Like, go to the Institute for Humane Education website, which is humaneeducation.org, and there's loads of materials there. Share it with teachers in your community. Maybe get a copy of my book, The World Becomes What We Teach, for the school, for a teacher you know. And for yourself, this whole solutionary framework is one that we teach for individuals who want to be solutionaries themselves. I wrote a whole book for it. You mentioned it earlier, called The Solutionary Way: Transform Your Life, Your Community, and the World for the Better. And so I invite people to, read the book. You can get it from your library. And also, I invite people to listen to my new podcast, Solutionary Voices, because I'm interviewing people on the forefront of building a more just, humane, and sustainable world as solutionaries. And I want to amplify the voices of people doing that.
Thank you so much for coming on the show today, Zoe.
Thank you so much for having me, Jasper. It's great to see you.